Good day to you, Year 9, and welcome to our next lesson. We are going to be looking at the blood and what is inside the blood. This is week 5, and this will be lesson number 3. There are 2 videos for this. I will direct you when you need to go on to the other much shorter video. It's just a little clip where you need to take some information from it. But I'll let you know when we get to that. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the blood, what the blood is made of, what each of the functions is of the blood, and why it's important. So before we get going, something that should look familiar to you, on the left-hand side, we have got some different stages of organization in multicellular organisms: cells, organelles, organs, tissues, and organ systems. But they are not in the correct order. So can you put them into the correct order, going from smallest to largest? And for each one, can you give one example for each of them? So if you pause the video and do that now, please. Okay, so hopefully you've had a go at that. And we should have organelles as the smallest. So this includes things like mitochondria, chloroplasts, the nucleus, ribosomes, all of the stuff that you find inside cells. The next level is cells. So ones that we have gone over in the past. You've got red blood cells, sperm cells, egg cells, neurons. You've got phloem and xylem in plants, or palisade cells. Lots of different types of cells. The next level up is tissues, where you have similar cells coming together to form a function, and these include things like muscles, tendons, cartilage, ligaments. The next stage up is organs. So this is where you have different tissues performing a function. So lots of different organs. You might have mentioned things from the digestive system that we've been covering. So stomach, small intestine, large intestine, liver, pancreas. You might have said other ones like the brain, the heart, and things like that. And the final level is organ systems, so where you've got lots of different organs performing a function. And one that we went into a lot of detail was the digestive system, but now we're on the circulatory system. But you have got other ones, the reproductive systems, the nervous system, and things like that. Okay, so what we need to take from this lesson is knowing the different components of blood. So what is the blood made of, what the function is for each of those. Hopefully we should be able to recognize those if we saw them, and hopefully also for 7 to 8 we could suggest how some of them are adapted for their function. Okay, so here are some pictures of some insects. And they are obviously multicellular, contain lots of cells, different cells forming different functions. The question is, do you think that insects have blood the same as what we do? Okay, so have a little ponder of that. Do you think it is the same? What do they have instead if you think that it is different? Okay, so hopefully you've had a think about that. And you probably came to the conclusion that they don't have the same blood as us. If you accidentally tread on an insect, so it doesn't have red blood like our blood. The only exception being things like mosquitoes and leeches that do go red, but that's just because they've been drinking our blood. So they do have a fluid inside them, but it's not like the blood that we have. Okay, it's called hemolymph, and it is kind of a mixture of blood and also lymphatic fluid. And we have lymphatic fluid inside us, and it kind of just takes away some of the nasty stuff. The most important difference is that hemolymph doesn't transport oxygen, and they don't have red blood cells, which is what gives our blood that red colour. Now, you don't need to write any of that down. It's just the interesting fact of the day. Okay, so we are looking in more detail about the circulatory system. This will be our first lesson really on the circulatory system. Obviously you do a little bit at Key Stage 3, but we're going to be looking at different parts of the circulatory system. It is another system, obviously incredibly important, and it's all about sort of moving or transporting stuff around the body. So if you've got a unicellular organism like a bacteria or something like that, they've got a much larger surface area to volume ratio. So they don't need to transport stuff around because they're not very big. Most of it just diffuses across the cell membrane. But the bigger you get, the smaller the surface area to volume ratio is. And that means we need a special system inside us that transports everything that we need for all of our cells around our body. And we call that system the circulatory system. And the circulatory system consists of the blood, which we're going to look at today, the blood vessels, which will be Thursday's lesson, and then we're going to move on to the heart, which we'll start looking at next week.
Blood is the largest organ in our body.
Different components.
10 pints of life force coursing through thousands of miles of arteries, veins, and capillaries.
Four main elements to it. So what I'm going to ask you to do now,
those blood vessels carry blood to every other organ, keeping them functioning and thriving.
Click on the link to the other video, and it's just going to show you
our red blood cells carry oxygen and nutrients.
And I'd like you to
our platelets stop bleeding and help to heal our wounds.
To the blood.
Our white cells protect us against infection.
You could leave this video and go on to the other video.
And the yellow liquid plasma in which they are suspended carries an array of proteins
that
regulate
back.
bleeding
Hopefully,
and
we
clotting.
had a look at the video to have a look at what it contains. And hopefully we picked up these kind of four main parts to it. Now, the vast majority of your blood is made up of a liquid called plasma. And the plasma is really important because that's where the other cells move around in. It also contains some substances, dissolved substances. It's where you'll find things like hormones. That's how they get transported around. And also there'll be some carbon dioxide in there. The next sort of main part to our blood is the red blood cells, which you should be familiar with. Is one of the specialized cells that we do need to know about. And you probably already know what their main function is. It's about moving oxygen around. The next one is white blood cells. Now, these are very important because these go around the blood, and if they find any pathogens, which are microorganisms inside your body, then they will actually attack them. And the last sort of main component of the blood is something called platelets. Platelets are really important because that's where we get scabs from. So that's what clots the blood so that you don't just bleed to death. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is copy this table. Again, if you have access to a printer, feel free to print, but it's going to be a reasonably straightforward one. If we get this table down, I would suggest having the adaptations as your biggest column, as shown in the table that I've put on here. But you are going to want to take up a reasonable amount of your page, so if you've only got a little bit left, then start a new page. So we've got the four components of blood that we just spoke about, the red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets and plasma. And we're going to go over all of those, and we're going to look at what the function is, and then adaptations that those cells or parts have for their role. And the last column is the percentage composition. So if you were to take some blood, what percentage of it would be red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, or plasma. So if you could pause the video now, copy down that table, and then we'll go through the four components of blood. Okay, so we're going to start going through the four components of blood. I will go through sort of the main bits as we go, but please do not copy all of the information. Listen to me, then pause, read through it, and then add to your table as necessary. So we're going to start with the main sort of component of blood, and that is the plasma. And it's that yellowy liquid. Sometimes if you have a very small cut, you get that kind of sticky, yellowy liquid that comes out. That actually is the plasma. And it's the plasma that gives the liquid for the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets to move around the body. Now, carbon dioxide that's produced during respiration from all of the cells will dissolve into the plasma. So the red blood cells are not the ones that are taking the carbon dioxide back to the lungs. It's actually in this plasma. You also carry urea in it. So urea is formed from the liver through a breakdown of proteins and things like that. And it will actually be transported in the plasma, and then it will go to the kidneys where it's removed. There will also be, which was a big thing that we spoke about in the last topic, there's also going to be all of the small soluble products of digestion. So those amino acids from protein, those simple sugars from carbohydrates, and the fatty acids and glycerol from fat. Now you'll see that in the bottom, at the bottom in the middle, there is actually a test tube. And what you can do is you can take a sample of blood and you can put it in a test tube and you can spin it around really, really fast. It's called a centrifuge. And it all separates out the blood. And you can see on there that it tells you the different percentages of each part. So you can use that to fill in the last column of your table. Okay, so if you pause this now, complete your table for blood plasma, and then pop in the percentage compositions. Okay, so we're going to move on, and we're now going to look at the red blood cells. And the scientific name for red blood cells, you don't need to write this down, is erythrocytes. Okay. Now, there's a huge number of red blood cells in the body. There's about 5 million in every millimetre cubed of blood. So huge, huge amount of them. The most abundant of all of the blood cells. They're really important because they will carry oxygen around the body. Now, it's not just that they're there to carry the oxygen, but they've also adapted because they can attract the oxygen from the alveoli in the lungs into themselves. And they use a chemical that you might have heard of called hemoglobin. Okay, hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin contains iron, and iron does attract oxygen. That's why iron things rust. Okay, and it's also why red blood cells have that rusty colour, because when the oxygen joins with the iron, it makes that reddy colour. Now, they are adaptive for their function in several ways. They've got a biconcave disc, or they are a biconcave disc, and that just means that there's a bigger surface area. So where it dips in the middle, it just increases the surface area so that more oxygen can diffuse across it. They've got that red pigment that I spoke about, hemoglobin, and that binds with oxygen. And also another adaptation that I'm sure you remember from specialized cells is that they don't have a nucleus. And that's quite important because it just makes more room for hemoglobin. It also means that they are unable to divide themselves to make new ones, so they're constantly being made in our bone marrow from stem cells. Okay, so can you pause the video now, please? get down the information about red blood cells in your table, and then we will move on to the white blood cells. Okay, so hopefully we've got about red blood cells. We're going to move on to white blood cells. And there's lots of different white blood cells. As you can see on the bottom left picture, these are 5 different white blood cells that we have. They all have a different role in fighting diseases. You do not need to know all of the names of the different white blood cells. Most of them referred to as lymphocytes and phagocytes. You'll do more about those when we come to doing about diseases. Now, white blood cells are much larger than red blood cells, and there's fewer of them in the body. They're really important because they are the ones that are fighting diseases. So some of them go along and just basically eat the microorganisms. Other ones produce things called antibodies, which you might have heard of in the news a lot at the moment about antibody testing for COVID-19. That's because they produce these antibodies that stick to the microorganisms, stops them kind of working, and then they're eaten by the phagocytes. Now, once you have fought a disease, quite often you'll have these white blood cells that just remain in your body for the rest of your life, producing these antibodies if needs be, which is why they think that if you have caught COVID-19, you won't catch it again. But because some organisms change quite a lot, it means that the antibodies don't work anymore, which is why we keep getting things like colds and the flu, which are also types of coronaviruses. So if you could pause the video, have a read through, fill your table in to make sure that you've got everything about white blood cells, and then we'll move on to the last part, which are platelets. Okay, so platelets are kind of just fragments of cells. They're not a cell themselves. They don't have a nucleus, but they are going around in our blood, and they're just kind of bits of broken up cell. And they're really important because they stop the blood from leaving the blood vessels by creating a clot. Okay, and that's quite often what we see if it's a cut on the outside. It's quite often what we see as a scab. So it just means that it closes up the blood vessels so you don't keep losing blood. It's also really important because if you have a scab over it, it means the bacteria and things like that can't get in. It kind of produces a barrier against them. Now, you don't need to worry about fibrinogen and fibrin, but it's basically that these two enzymes will control the chemical reactions, control the formation of a scab. What we do need to know though is the function is to clot the blood. We need to know that they are just fragments of cells, so their adaptations, they're just fragments of cells with no nucleus, and that they come together to form a jelly-like clot. Okay, so that's pretty much it about platelets. Nothing too thrilling, but very, very important in our body. So if you pause the video now, make sure you've got everything down on that. And we'll move on to some questions. Okay, so we're going to look at some questions now that I would like you to have a go at answering, and then self-assess them at the end. So we've got 3 questions. Question number 1, state 3 functions of the blood, so jobs that the blood has. And that's going to be 3 marks, obviously a mark for each correct one. Question 2, part A, explain why it is not accurate to describe blood as a red liquid. Question 2, part B, what makes blood red? Question 2, part C, identify 3 important functions of blood plasma. And then question number 3, discuss the main ways in which the blood helps you to avoid infection. Okay, and describe the different parts of the blood that are involved. And that's actually going to be a 6 marker. So you've got to think about the different parts of the blood, how they avoid infection, what they do to so we don't get ill. So if you could pause the video now, have a go at answering those, and then we'll go over the answers when you're done. Okay, so hopefully you've had a go at those questions to do with the blood. So grab yourself a different colour pen or pencil, and we'll go over the answers. So question 1 was state 3 functions of the blood. So here we've got a list of things that they do. So you need to pick out if you have mentioned any of these. So transport blood cells, transport gases or dissolved gases. You might have said transport carbon dioxide or transport oxygen, that's fine. Transporting food or soluble molecules. Transporting hormones. Removing waste products. Or you might have said about removing urea. Fighting infections. And also clotting the blood. So any of those will be good answers. You needed 3, so hopefully we got 3 marks for that. Okay, question 2A was explain why it is not accurate to describe blood as a red liquid. And that's because blood is made up of plasma. So the main part of blood is plasma, in which you find the red blood cells. So the red blood cells are inside the plasma, will get you 2 marks. Part B, 2B, was what makes blood red. So you either could say red blood cells, or you could have said hemoglobin. Either one of those is the correct answer. And finally, question 3, which was the 6 marker, discuss the main ways in which the blood helps you to avoid infection. Include a description of the parts of the blood involved. So if you have said that white blood cells, said anything about white blood cells protecting us from infection, you might have said that white blood cells produce antibodies. That would be a mark. You could have said that they engulf or eat the microorganisms or bacteria or viruses, any of those. You might have said that platelets are fragments of cells, and that they're to do with clotting the blood to keep the microbes or bacteria, viruses out. So quite tricky for that, because there's 2 parts really of the blood that are to do with fighting infections or have a role in fighting infections. So hopefully we were able to pick up some of those marks. But you might have been really good and got all of them. Okay, so that is it from today. So hopefully we have taken from this lesson what we really need to know from the specification. What we need to know from this lesson is the 4 main parts of the blood. So red blood cells, white blood cells, plasma and platelets. We need to know what each of those do. So what the function of red blood cells is, what the function of white blood cells is, etc. And also, hopefully, for the higher level, can talk about how they're adapted for their function. So what they have that enables them to be really good at their job. Okay, that is it for our first lesson on the circulatory system. Tomorrow we are going to be looking at the blood vessels, so where the blood moves around in. And then we'll be moving on to the organ that pumps it all around, which is the heart. So have a lovely day, take care of yourselves, and you'll hear from me tomorrow. Thank you very much, Year 9. Goodbye.